So this video right here is going to focus on this part of your graphic organizer that focuses on key concept 8.2, which are new movements for civil rights and liberal efforts to expand the role of government, generated a range of political and cultural responses. So 8.2, Roman numeral 2, responding to social conditions in the African American civil rights movement, a variety of movements emerged that focus on issues of identity, social justice, and the environment. So A, feminist and gay and lesbian activists mobilized behind claims for legal, economic, and social equality. B, Latino, American Indian, and Asian American movements continued to demand social and economic equality and a redress of past injustices. C, despite an overall influence in post-war America, advocates raised concern about the prevalence and persistence of poverty as a national problem. We're not really going to touch on this video. Environmental problems and accidents led to a growing environmental movement that aimed to use legislative and public efforts to combat pollution and protect natural resources. The federal government established new environmental programs and regulations. So we're going to go over A, B, and D. Really feminist, American Indian, environmental, but I'm going to actually touch on one thing that deals with this, gay and lesbian, one thing we've already discussed with Latino, and then Asian American, and I am going to cheat and I'm going to use these wonderful Quizlets that people put on the internet to just touch on a couple of things. One thing that is founded as part of the Asian American sort of push for different rights, founded is the Asian American Political Alliance, founded in 1968 by students of Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and other Asian descent at the University of California, Berkeley, to promote the rights and culture of Asian Americans. And I'm sure that I could go on more, but I just want to touch on at least one thing for all of these so you have some type of reference. Now, as far as Latino rights, we've discussed the Chicano and the Chicana movement. Go back to me talking about they're the ones that, part of the civil rights movement, they wanted more rights for Mexican Americans, and they are the ones that chose that. Remember that Battle of Puebla that was fought on the 5th of May, where the Mexicans beat the French army, and they weren't supposed to beat them, so it was like the underdog beating the, strong power, and so they picked that as their rallying point for the Chicano movement. So that would be part of the Latino movement. And then just very quickly, the gay liberation movement is going to really be set off by a police raid on the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar in New York City. And it's going to spark a riot, but it's also sort of like the beginning of the gay rights movement. And people are going to start to urge, this is where your people that are gay, homosexual, are asked, they can start to become open about their identity. And so just like with the civil rights movement, they're trying to end discrimination against gay, homosexual, lesbian. I hope I'm using the right terms. Okay, so just wanted to give you a reference point for the three that I'm not going to talk on about a lot, and then I am going to talk about the feminist, environmental, and American Indian movement in a little bit more detail. All right, so to move on to some other reform movements, first one to talk about is the feminist movement. So after World War II, 2/3 of women are going to return to their house and become housewives in the cult of domesticity that we've discussed, and 1/3 of women are actually going to want to remain in the workforce. Different than World War I, where a lot of them go back to the home, there's a large percentage that want to stay in the workforce. And Betty Friedan is going to write a book called The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and this book is going to challenge this conformity of what women are supposed to do, and say that, maybe women aren't happy with this idea of the cult of domesticity. Now, this other book that I have here, Irene Levin, The Stepford Wives, is about, I believe these women live in a neighborhood, and these women that are so perfect, and they want to be these subservient housewives, end up actually being robots. They made a movie about it in the 70s based off the book, and they actually made another one in 2004. I think Nicole Kidman was in it. I've never actually seen it. But the book, not the Stepford Wives, but The Feminine Mystique, was going to be inspiration for what's called second wave feminism. First wave feminism is focused on suffrage, whereas second wave feminism is first wave suffrage slash, in parentheses, voting rights and property rights. And then the second wave feminism is going to focus on things like reproductive rights, bringing attention to domestic violence, focusing on the family, women's sexuality. Okay, so that's what they consider second wave feminism. And I was reading, even in the 80s, they have what's third wave feminism, which includes more of, the second wave feminists even didn't, have, you still were looked down upon if you were in certain careers or whatever, if I'm understanding it correctly. And third wave feminism even includes, women that are prostitutes and things like that, and bringing awareness to those type of women, more minorities, etc., etc. So this book is also the second wave feminism in this feminist movement, which is a political, cultural, and economic movement that sought to establish greater rights and legal protections for women. It's going to inspire the formation of the National Organization of Women, which is now, is going to support the failed Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which was going to outlaw discrimination based on gender in 1971. It actually needed 38 states to ratify the amendment. It fell 3 short. A woman named Phyllis Schlafly is going to be against it. She's a conservative. She felt that it was going to hinder more than it hurt. It was going to, hinder women more than it helped them. She felt like if this were passed, then they would make women go in the military. You would start having things like unisex bathrooms, same-sex marriage would be allowed. She felt that the woman should still be part of a traditional home life. This is interesting because they haven't forced women in the military, but we start talking about things like unisex bathrooms. I mean, these are all things that, possibly are on the horizon soon, and even the same-sex marriage that is starting, that has been ruled that that's legal. So all these things that she said were, scared it's going to happen. A lot of them have happened. And, some people argue that it doesn't matter, it's fine. So that's Phyllis Schlafly. They're also going to support who was against the Equal Rights Amendment, and partly because of her being against it is why it's going to fail. They supported legalized abortion, and they're going to achieve with the Supreme Court case of Roe versus Wade. They supported the passage of Title 10 of the Public Health Services Act, which is going to provide federal funding and family planning and contraceptives. And they also support the passage of Title 9 of the Education Amendment in 1972, which states that any educational institution receiving federal funding may not discriminate against anyone based on gender. This is part of, if you've ever heard why, like, for example, LSU doesn't have a men's soccer team because they have so many men's sports already. They have to have the same number of women's varsity, for lack of a better word, sports, and so that's why there's no men's soccer team at LSU, because under Title IX, things have to be equal as part of it. So you've probably heard Title IX in the realm of sports, and that is Betty Friedan, and this is some women protesting women's liberation, and this is discussing or praising Roe versus Wade. Also going to get an environmental movement, and this is going to be inspired by a book that Mr. Mitchell says that they like this book on the AP test called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and it's going to support the creation of federal laws to outlaw the use of DDT and other environmentally harmful pesticides. And they're going to be successful in accomplishing things, especially the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is ironically, you would think, if we were thinking today's Republicans and Democrats, you would think this would be something passed under a Democrat, but it was actually passed under Richard Nixon, and it's going to create this agency is going to be responsible for the protection of human health and environment in the U.S. It establishes International Celebration of Earth Day, which was actually a week and a half ago. I believe it's April 22nd or something like that. Okay, and then finally, the last reform movement, we're going to look at the American Indian Movement, the AIM, sought to bring attention to the problems of poverty and poor living standards on reservations. I may or may not have mentioned this to you. If you go to the Grand Canyon is where you can really see this. I mean, there are a lot of American Indians living in just absolute poverty. It's very, very sad, the situations they're living in. They had like these sort of rundown campers, and they didn't even look like they had electricity or running water to their places. It was really sad around the Grand Canyon. So you still have a lot of poverty and poor living standards on tribal lands or reservations, and broken treaties. So a lot of, as it said in the key concept, trying to gain back things that were lost from the American Indians as part of these movements. For some, it's obviously the gay rights or maybe even the women's movement isn't about getting back what was lost or getting reparations or getting, the government to apologize or anything like that. It's more about getting equal rights, whereas the American Indian movement, part of that is, and part of even the civil rights movement, is what it says in the key concept, redress of past injustices, okay? They're going to gain national attention when 500 members are going to storm and vandalize the Bureau on Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. in 1972, and they're also going to seize control of the town of Wounded Creek, South Dakota, and conduct a standoff with federal marshals for 71 days. And one other thing is going to be in 75, the Indian Self-Determination Act is going to give reservations and tribal lands greater control over internal programs, education, and law enforcement. I know that my cousin was at a casino and there was an issue with something, and there was a law enforcement officer that was part of the tribal land, because a lot of the casinos in Louisiana are on tribal land. It's the one in Kinder, and it wasn't the local law enforcement that came and took care of the situation. It was actually one of these reserve police officers from the tribal land. So they still have sort of like autonomy on their reservations or tribal lands. Okay, so just to review a couple of things, okay, if you want to look at the Asian Americans, we have the Asian American Political Alliance for the Gay Rights Movement. That's going to start with the Stonewall riots, which is the police coming into the Stonewall Inn in New York City. Then remember, for the Mexican Americans, or the Latino example that I gave you, is the Chicano movement. That has to do with the Battle of Puebla, the story I've told several times. And then for the women's rights movement, that's all focused on, starts off with Betty Friedan in the book The Feminine Mystique, and sort of women getting out of this culture of domesticity, which leads to Roe versus Wade, Title IX, National Organization of Women, a failed Equal Rights Amendment. Okay, when you talk about the environmental movement, that kind of starts with Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, leads to the EPA, okay, founding of International Earth Day. And then with the Indians, you have the American Indian movement that are going to gain national attention, vandalizing the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they're going to seize control of the town of Wounded Creek, South Dakota. And that is basically, combine that with the civil rights movement. Those are going to be a lot of your reform movements from the 60s, 70s, etc.